A handout. There's a prayer on top, which we'll actually then talk about a bit. Please pray with me. O root of Jesse, who stands among the people as a sign, before you kings will keep their mouths shut. To you the nations will pray. Come, deliver us, delay no longer. God of peace, ever faithful to your promises, the earth rejoices in hope of our Savior's coming and looks forward with longing to his return at the end of time. Prepare our hearts to receive him when he comes, for he is Lord forever and ever. Amen. So a nerdy church joke I'll start with today is Happy New Year. Because it's the new year for the church calendar, right? It's the first day, right? So last Sunday was Christ the King, a Sunday when we think about the fact that Jesus is King. He's going to return. He's going to establish the kingdom that he proclaimed the first time he was here. Right, if we go back to Revelation, which we spent some time with a while back, right at the end we agreed, see, the home of God is among immortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will go with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away. Right, so that's the end. Today we start over. We start at the beginning, right? So Advent, as I wasn't in all of the first church service, but I was in the tail end of it, and I heard the language of Advent is about waiting. Advent is about preparation, right? So that's a season that we're in. What we do with Advent is we put ourselves in the shoes of ancient Israel, who's waiting for Jesus to come the first time. Right? So we don't start with him. We put ourselves in this sort of period of we're waiting for him to come, right? And of course we make connections to the fact that we're waiting for him to come again. Right? So it's both this sort of, we put ourselves in the shoes of Israel waiting for the Messiah to come the first time, and we who know who he is, Jesus of Nazareth, right? We are waiting for him to return, right? So this is where we're in. So on the top of my handout, I've got a couple of things. I've got a hymn, but right underneath that, I've got some quotes from books. So as you can imagine, Christine and I have a library with all kinds of books in them, right? And we've got a bunch of books on Advent, not just Advent devotionals, but how to do worship during Advent, how to think about Advent, right? So books for pastors during Advent, and they almost all have this kind of a tone where they talk about Advent being a season that's out of step. It's a difficult season. One of the reasons for that is we're getting ready for Christmas, right? So again, go upstairs. There's Christmas cookies. There's ornaments. We're already buying presents, right? So what's supposed to be actually a time of somewhat like a Lent, it's a time of penance, has turned into this period where we're eating candy all the time, right? We're not eating it. It's kind of constant, right? So Advent is oftentimes described as a season under stress, right? We have a hard time actually getting into the rhythm of what it's supposed to be, which is we're waiting for Jesus to come, right? A waiting that's rather urgent, right? It isn't this sort of like we're waiting for someone to come over for dinner. Is we're waiting for someone to fix all the bad and awful things that happen in the world. Right? So you can read some of those. This waiting is again tied up with both waiting for Jesus to come the first time and the second time, which means we have to bring the Old and the New Testaments together, right? And we see this in Advent hymns. That's why I'm going to draw attention to a couple of hymns, right? So the line in the prayer I had as praise is from what's called the O antiphons, right? It's this hymn that goes back to the 6th century. A paraphrase of it is the basis for the hymn, O come, Emmanuel, right? So I always think it's cool when singing the hymn, O Come, Emmanuel, that we're singing a hymn that Christians have been singing for about 1,500 years. Right? It's a very old hymn. Right? And so that's this first line, one of the titles given to Jesus, because that's how every verse of that hymn begins, with these titles. Right? The one that we're used to is what? Emmanuel. It's a title for Jesus, God go with us. Another title is O Root of Jesse. Who's a Jesse?
Ruth's descendant.
What's that? Ruth's descendant, right? That's one way to put it. King David's dad, right? It's the context, right? So a connection is being made to Jesus, connecting him to David, right? It's a poetic way of putting this, right? And to other people as well, which we're going to come back to, right? So, I mean, it's just worth pointing out, right, that we've got these hymns that are, what are they doing? They're going back and grabbing all these Old Testament titles, right? If you actually read through the original hymn, I went through it the other day and counted 50 either quotes or allusions to the Old Testament. I mean, that little short hymn is just packed full, right? And almost all the references are to the Old Testament, right? We see the same kind of pattern in the hymn, Lo how a rose ere blooming, which I put there, right? There in the very first line. We again have a reference to Jesse, right? So there's this huge theme of, we're getting all of these terms that are coming out of the Old Testament, and they're being applied to Jesus, right? So the version of this that you're used to in the hymn goes something like, O come thou root of Jesse, free thine own from Satan's tyranny, from the depths of hell thy people to save, and give them the victory o'er the grave. I think I put that in a footnote, right? This is a nice poetic verse. It's true, but I like the original better, which is what I translated for you in the first line of the prayer, because it gets us this idea that Jesus is coming as a sign, but more so, he's a king, right? In his presence, other kings keep their mouths shut. I like that line, right? It's kind of this, gives us an idea of who he is. He's the one to whom the nations will pray, come, deliver us, delay no longer. There's this urgency of, come, things are bad, have mercy on us, right? This is hope that's coming from this whole time, right? I will just draw your attention to the fact of, when you either hear this Advent or sing O Come, Emmanuel, pay attention to the verses, right? Every one begins with a title that's actually about Jesus, right? So we actually, the original order is a bit different. It ends with Emmanuel. That's the last verse, right? Because we're really going to get to the idea that Jesus is God with us. The first one is one that we actually sang in a church today, to wisdom. Right, that's actually the first verse. So it goes, O wisdom, O God, or O Adonai, O root of Jesse, O King of David, O Dawn of the East, O King of the nations, and finally, O Emmanuel, right? And almost all of those titles are coming out of the Old Testament, right? They're these Old Testament titles being applied to Jesus, right? The only one that isn't is the one about Day Spring, which comes from the Gospel of Luke. But that's actually an allusion to the Old Testament and all these ideas of the light coming into the darkness. Right? This Old Testament theme going throughout it. That's where these hymns are getting their inspiration. So the first Bible verse I want you to see is from Isaiah. It's there on the first page, Isaiah chapter 11. Right. Notice how it begins. A shoot shall come out of the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. So all this language of Jesse we see in our hymns. Here's the ultimate a source of it, right? This prophecy from Isaiah that's saying, this is who this person is we're going to talk about. He will come out of the stump of Jesse. So he's going to be a descendant of David, right? That's what this is arguing. If we keep going here, we read the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of the knowledge and the fear of the Lord, right? If you're going to read a New Testament, what is this verse talking about? Think of a New Testament story to which this might apply.
Oh, Pentecost?
No, Pentecost could be one, but there's even a bigger one very early on. What's that? Luke 1. There's probably some things there with the Holy Spirit, but...
Oh, the baptism of...
Baptism, right? So when Jesus gets baptized, what happens? The Holy Spirit comes down like a dove, right? Sits on him, right? And then what happens? Voice comes from heaven and says, "This is my son who I'm well pleased." But then what does Jesus do afterwards?
Goes into the desert.
He goes into the wilderness, and actually we read the Spirit drives him out into the wilderness.
I read someplace just recently that he baptized the rest of them.
What's that?
I'm sure I just read recently that it was something to that Jesus baptized the rest of the people there.
We don't actually have any evidence that Jesus baptized anyone. I mean, he seems to have other people do it. But here, there's actually this big scene in the Gospels of Jesus gets baptized, the Spirit comes upon him, he goes out into the wilderness. What does he do? He prays for 40 days. What's that an allusion to? Israel wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. It's just kind of all hard. It's so obvious that Jesus is supposed to be Israel over and over and over again. Right?
I always thought 40 just sort of meant time. You think about his life.
He couldn't fast for 40 years, right? It could take a while, but 40 days is possibly manageable, right? But that's the connection. So there's all these connections being made, right? The gospel authors have these Old Testament passages in mind, and they're showing us that this is how Jesus is fulfilling all these things, right? What does he do? He fears the Lord. He doesn't judge based on appearances or what people say or do, but with righteousness. Keep going here. He has a special concern for the poor and the oppressed. He'll punish those who afflict them. I think this is worth sort of saying. Politics are part of what the church should be involved with to a degree, because God cares about the world. We should too. We're going to have to figure out how we do that. But this clear thing here of we're supposed to get involved with what happens in the world and advocate, especially for the poor and oppressed, right? The bulk of this passage, right, is things that we would have to say are fulfilled in Jesus' second coming, though, right? So looking at verse 6, right? The wolf shall lie with the lamb, the leopard with the kid, the calf and the lion, right? All of these things. There's going to be peace, right? We get into all this stuff about nations. They're not going to be in conflict with Israel anymore. Everyone will come to Israel, right? This is all Jesus' second coming. So this Isaiah passage is talking about what Jesus is going to do, but it's mixed up his first and his second coming. Or it's actually seen all of this as his one task, right? If we look at verse 9, he talks about peace on my holy mountain. What's the only holy mountain in the Bible? Well, Sinai's one, but it's actually, there's even a bigger one, Mount Zion, which is not really much of a mountain at all, but it's what's in Jerusalem, right? So there's always this reference to there's going to be peace here. Again, something quite important in good light of present news, right? If we go to the final verse 16, right? We read about a highway from Assyria for the remnant of the people, right? They're going to come back. The exile is going to be over, right? If we go to the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke, John the Baptist is out there doing what? He's preparing a way for the Lord. He's going to make the path straight. That's actually a quote from Isaiah 40. But here we have the same idea of the path to come back to Israel, to be liberated, is going to be made straight. Right? So this is all kind of here in this passage, right? And it's talking about what the ancient Israel thought the Messiah was going to do. And our Advent hymns pick all of this up. Like Advent music, Advent devotions, they tend to go to all these Old Testament prophecies, right? Because this is what the church has done. It's even what the New Testament does. It goes back to the Old, finds all of this stuff, right? And says, this is what Jesus came to do, right? It presumes the New Testament, the story of Jesus, that we know our Old Testaments and see all of this. The problem is we don't, right? We've kind of lost it, right? Another passage, this one's from 1 Samuel. So this is when David's actually got chosen to be the king. Samuel's told to go visit Jesse. Jesse has 7 sons. All of them are brought before Samuel, and he rejects all of them until he gets the youngest, David, right? And part of the reason for this comes in verse 7. I've got it bolded. Do not look on his appearance or on his height or of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on outward appearances, but the Lord looks on the heart. I mean, this is an interesting connection back to Jesus, right? Or in Isaiah 11, of he doesn't judge on appearances, rather what's in the heart, right? It's this idea of righteousness. So David is being compared to Jesus is being compared to both David, but also to God who chose David to be king, right? That's what's happening with him, right? So it's just worth pointing out that this is what's happening. If we go to the New Testament, I got 2 passages on here. I'm going to start with the one on the bottom, Romans 1, right? So Paul's letter to the Romans is, apart from the Gospels, probably the most preached or commented on book in the New Testament. And look how he begins. How does he introduce himself in this letter, right? He says, I, Paul, a servant of the Messiah, or the Christ, Jesus, called as an apostle, set apart for what? For the sake of the gospel, or the good news of God, which God promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Well, what is Paul talking about? The Old Testament, because most of the New doesn't exist yet. Right? So he can only be talking about the Old. He's talking about the prophets. So he says right at the very beginning of what his magnum opus, if you want to know who this Jesus person is, you have to go read your Old Testaments. Right? It's part of what he's saying. This is how you actually get his identity, right? So he stresses this over and over again. And again, if you read Romans, he's constantly going back to the Old Testament and explaining things. Right? If we go to Matthew 1, and we're going to spend some time here, right? This is the kind of thing that people skip over. You get to the Bible, you read the New Testament, you get a bunch of names. Okay, I'm done. I'm going to just a skip, right? It's boring. It's boring in part because we don't understand what they're doing. We think it's just a family tree, and there's a whole lot more happening, right? So you've probably heard some things about this list before. I know I've done at least twice an Advent lesson on this, right? And talked about especially the women on there, right? How this is very unusual. I'm going to do something a bit different today, and just to see the other things that are going on here and explain what's happening, right? So the first verse, that's probably the title. They didn't have titles back then. They didn't put like a title page in their name, right? In fact, the words, the Gospel of Matthew, could nowhere appear in the original. We've given it that title, right? It begins by saying, the book of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Basically telling us this is what this book is about. It's about this Jesus guy. Who is he? Well, he's the son of David and the son of Abraham. It's actually telling us who he is, right? Go ahead.
Is that to start out to giving him credibility?
I mean, that's part of it. Part of it is giving him some credibility, but it's also telling us who he is, right? I mean, the big point here I want to make is even with this title and with what he does in these first 17 verses, Matthew is saying, this isn't a new story. This story has a background. Right? My examples that I would say is, I mean, imagine if you watched Star Wars Return of the Jedi without watching the first two. Like, what's going on in this movie? Who are these people? What do you mean this is the dad and this is the son, right? Or if you watch Godfather 2 without watching the first one, it'd be a terrible movie. Godfather 3 is terrible, right? But I mean, it's this idea of we're not coming into a new story. This is like volume 4, right? It's a sequel. It's the rest of the story. So the New Testament doesn't exist independently. The Jesus story doesn't operate independently, right? It's got this back story. And if you actually want to understand it, you have to know that backstory. That's what he's telling us right at the start of all of these people. They're people you need to know if you're going to understand who Jesus is. Right? This is part of what he's doing, right? Because the way these glyphs operate, these kinds of glyphs are everywhere in the Old Testament and in other sort of ancient Near Eastern literature, right? So this is an oral culture. There's not a whole lot of literature, right? If you start a name dropping, people know who you're talking about, right? Because everybody's got the same stories. If you're an Israelite, you've heard these stories over and over and over again. So if I say, right, Rehoboam, they know what I'm talking about. They know the story. They've got it all because they've heard them over and over and over again, right? It's us who have to go look it up, right? Because we don't hear these stories over and over and over again. We hyper-focus on the new, right? So he's basically telling us if you want to follow this Jesus story, you need to know who these other people are. And that's what you can find. You can find these lists, and then occasionally the author begins to explain who these people are. So there's a similar genealogy in First Chronicles chapter 2. It's names, and then there's a pause because it's talking about Judah, and then it says, and he had 2 more sons with his daughter-in-law Tamar, and it explains the whole story, right? So like, maybe you don't know this story. It's kind of a rare one. But that's how these things work. If you can have a list, and occasionally you can expand on it. That's actually how they're supposed to operate. You hear them all, and you go, I know that story, I know that story, I know that story, I know that story. It's not just names. It's not a family tree. It's a spiritual family tree, I guess. In terms of, you're supposed to sort of say, yes, I understand all these other stories and say these stories are the backstory for the story I'm presently telling. Right? I know that's complicated, but that's how they would operate, right? So he's trying to tell us, if you want to know who Jesus is, you've got to understand this back story. Otherwise, you're going to get a distorted picture of him, right? And he does it, I would highlight also, by he wants us to connect Jesus' story to the oldest story, or sort of the primary story of the Old Testament. That's my quiz for you. What is the story in the Old Testament? There's one just dominant story, which gets told over and over and over again. Out of Egypt, the Exodus. That is the basic story of the Old Testament, right? That God saves Israel from Egypt, right? And Matthew, that's what he wants us to pay attention to, right? So if we try to read this genealogy as a historical list, all kinds of problems happen. The first thing is he says there's 3 groups of 14. What's 14 times 3? 42, right? So there's 42 generations here. If we even go back to our Old Testament and try to sort of construct these lists, it doesn't work. Sometimes he just skips a generation. There's a couple times here where we go from basically a great-grandparent to their great-great-great-grandchild. It's not parent-child, parent-child, parent-child. He skips around. The time periods aren't identical. Some of these are like 400 or 500 years, some of them are like 2, right? So he's not really done his history well, right? Because that's not his intention. There are some weird patterns happening here, right? So the number 42 isn't historically a symbolic number, but it does appear in one important place in the Old Testament. And this is an observation that was first made by Origen, a theologian in the 3rd century, who goes and reads Numbers, which is quite a harrowing experience, if you ever read the book of the Numbers, right? And he gets to chapter 33. This isn't on your handout because it's really, really long, right? It's 56 verses. And Numbers chapter 33 is a record of every place Israel stopped and camped during the 40 years it was in the wilderness. How many spots do you think they stopped at? 42. Right? They stopped at 42, right? So he's perhaps making this connection of, think about these 42 people here in a way of, these are like stops along the way of the pre-story for Jesus, right? The fact that this is probably what he's doing, it becomes even more apparent if we would keep reading. And again, I couldn't get this on the handout, but what happens immediately after this genealogy? Verse 18, in chapter 1, the rest of it is the virgin birth. Then we get to chapter 2, and we get Herod and the Magi. And what happens? They go to Egypt. But first, right, Herod has all the babies killed. They escape. They go to Egypt, right? Egypt, right? And it ends by saying, so this is Matthew chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. And then Matthew tells us, this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, quote, out of Egypt I have called my son, right? So he wants us to think about this as the Exodus. It's just over and over and over again. Matthew says, Jesus, this whole story, you should be thinking of it in terms of the Exodus. God saved Israel from Egypt. How does he do this? Well, he sends them there to escape right, basically, what's the word I'm looking for? A drought and famine, right? And they're there for a while, and then they have to get saved from Egypt. Well, in a certain way, this is about Jesus, right? He goes to Egypt to be safe, and then he comes back from Egypt to save Israel, right? I mean, the New Testament is constantly telling us that Jesus is Israel. He's the personification of Israel. The most bold way this is put is in Galatians 3, where Paul basically just tells us, in the Old Testament it talks about Abraham's seed. It doesn't say seeds plural, it says seeds singular, and that person is Jesus. Everything, all the promises and prophecies about Israel in the Old Testament are ultimately about Jesus. Right? This particular Israelite, this Jewish person, is who all these Old Testament passages are talking about. Right? So if you pick up your New Testament and you don't have all that, you're going to try to make a sense of this Jesus story and cannot know what to do. Right? I mean, you're getting it's like you're reading a really long, like a series of books, and you started with the last one. Right? It's the ending, it's awesome, but you don't really understand it without the first, 9 volumes that came before. Right? And I think Advent's a really good time to reflect on this, because it's what we do in our music, it's what we do in the passages that we read, right? They're all kind of bringing us back to the Old Testament and explaining who Jesus is with a reference to the Old Testament.
So I know the Pharisees and Sadducees would not have the benefit of the New Testament, but would their observations of Christ cause them angst because they would know these writings or not?
Well, that does seem to be what's happened to a certain degree, is occasionally they do get into these conversations with a Jesus, and he opens their eyes, right? And they see things they didn't see before. I mean, one of the obvious ones would be someone like Nicodemus, right? Yeah. Who is kind of arguing with Jesus, but then things begin to make sense, right? And I think it's important that even in that passage, Jesus, because Jesus isn't exactly kind to Nicodemus. He says, "You are a teacher of Israel, and you don't know these things," right? I mean, he's finding a fault often with the teachers who don't understand, right? And then he proceeds to give them what according to him is the corrected interpretation of the Old Testament, right? Again, this is what he does on the road to Emmaus, right? He opens up the Old Testament and walks through all these recent events and says, "Don't you understand?" That's how he does it. It shows how the whole Old Testament pointed to him, right? Peter's first sermon does the same thing. He basically gives us an overview of the whole Old Testament. It says it points to Jesus. Stephen before he's stoned. I could go on and on and on here, right? This is actually how the New Testament operates from time to time. It pauses and says, look at this early Christian preaching. What are they doing? They're telling the story of the whole Old Testament and showing how it all points to Jesus. If you want to understand what's going on, right? Now, what tends to happen is, we can imagine, who are the two groups of people that are hearing the gospel in the first century? Well, one is other Jews who know their Old Testament, and with them the apostles have to argue about how to properly interpret it, right? When they go to the Gentiles, they don't know their Old Testaments at all. So they have to be taught it, right? But they usually teach to them in like chunks, or they get like basic narratives, or then they get more complicated narratives, right? What is even when we go back to Matthew, right? The title is Jesus the Messiah, a son of David, a son of Abraham. At a basic level, to know who Jesus is, you need to know who David is and who Abraham is. That's what he's telling us. That's the basic story. It would be even better if we expanded it and you know who all these other people were, right? I mean, you can think of it in terms of the Old Testament is the first volume of this is how God deals with the earth. God's going to save the world. How? Through Israel. What Israel doesn't fully understand is he's going to save the world through one particular Jewish person. Right? That's part of what the New Testament does, is it unpacks this. But it's a continuation of this Old Testament story, not a new one. It's not a backup plan. Right? Does that make sense? Other questions?
Is that how Israel justifies their military action?
Right, I mean, this is going to get us into all kinds of complicated things, right? Well, so if we look at the Old Testament, a big part of this message is God has given Israel this land, right? This is, I mean, for everything to happen, they need territory. They need to have an identity, right? And I mean, think of how all these Old Testament stories could work. There's always tragedy. How is this going to happen, right? So, Abraham, God says to Abraham, "I will make your descendants more numerous than the sand on the shore, than the stars in the sky." And he's 100 years old. He doesn't have any kids. His wife is 90. I know enough biology to say that we've got a problem here. Right? And what happens is God works a miracle, right? And she's pregnant and Isaac is born. Even when Abraham tries other ways, right? So he tries to take it into his own hands, and God says, that wasn't what I promised, right? I mean, there's story after story after story of this in the Old Testament of Israel's about to collapse, right? The big one is the Exodus, right? Of they're going to be destroyed. All the kids, all the firstborn males are going to die, right? God saves them, gives them their own country, right? The exiles are a repeat of this Exodus story, right? God had promised them to be a nation, and what happens is their country now splits. We get the kingdoms in the north and the south. There's not a unity, and they're both conquered. They're brought off into exile. It appears that God's promises are going to come to a naught. The story's over. Right? But what happens is God brings them out of exile. I mean, it's Exodus after Exodus after Exodus. I mean, that's the story of the Old Testament, right? And where are we when we get to the Jesus story? We don't know our history very well in the 400 years in between the Old and the New, but Israel's conquered again by basically the people who come after Alexander the Great. They then get their freedom back. If you have a Bible with the Apocrypha in it, you can read the Maccabees. That's what that's about. It's about they get their freedom back, and then they're conquered again by Rome. And that's where we are when we get to the New Testament, right? So, what do people expect is going to happen? The Messiah is going to come, and they're going to be rescued from Rome. In fact, you hear all of Jesus' the disciples are talking this way, the Pharisees are talking that way. But Jesus says, no, I'm here to do something different. It's a spiritual exodus for everyone. Right? God is going to liberate everyone from the forces of evil in the world. Sin, death, and the devil, right? So Jesus is, this plan that God makes with Israel, right? Because the promise from very early on is all of the other nations will come to know about God through Israel. And that's even this Isaiah passage, right? All the nations are going to stream in, right? He'll raise, this is verse 12, he'll raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth, right? That's about being in exile, right? He's going to bring them in. All the other nations will come, right? There'll be peace, right? But that happens through Jesus. We get to the end times stuff, and again, that's what he's going to do when he returns, right? But again, if we don't know that this is what God's going to do, has promised he's going to do through Israel since the very start of the Old Testament, we don't see how Jesus is connected to all those old promises, that he's the one fulfilling them, right? Sally, you have a puzzled look.
Thinking, God proclaimed Abraham's people to spread the word,
Yep.
to know about God, and they have a relationship with God. And Jesus came as a Jew. I'm thinking, when Jesus left, he had chosen 12 disciples. 11 of those, every one of them was a Jew. And when Jesus left, those 11 went out to spread the story.
Yep.
So it was still through the Jews
Right.
that we became Christians.
Right. Which is, again, these are these parts of the New Testament that we oftentimes don't know what to do with. But you get to, we could go to Romans, right? And how does Paul talk in Romans 11? It's talking about the fact that there's Jews and there's Greeks, which is just code for the non-Jews, right? Gentiles. And he says they're all going to come together, but how does this work? The Gentiles are grafted in. He's got this very clear way of saying, he uses this analogy of a tree. The tree is Israel. The Gentiles get grafted in. They don't get their own tree. Right? They get to become part of the story. The other major metaphor is we get adopted into Israel. God doesn't say, I have this other family over here. I've got, go on. What's going to happen is everybody becomes part of Israel, right? And what we've tended to do historically is say, no, we replaced Israel. And this is this long history of us sort of persecuting the Jews, right? If we go back to the contemporary things, we need to actually then say, how are we going to understand this, right? And the New Testament, I think, arguably tells us God's promises to Israel aren't ultimately about a land, right? So the promises to Abraham aren't about a land, they're about having a spiritual family, right? In which everybody in the world is supposed to be included, right? Now the whole conversation about what do you do when you're attacked as a nation is a whole different question, I think, right? But the real core issue here is everybody's supposed to get grafted into this tree. Everybody's supposed to become part of the family of Abraham, right? All we're currently doing, right? Well, it's the idea of covenant, right? And all we're doing is creating division, right?
Would that include Palestinians?
Oh, absolutely, it does. It includes all human beings, right?
And in terms of the land, my goodness, I think you can go way back into history.
Right. And this is
and realize that Palestinians and I don't know who they were, nomads,
right.
but of what origin the nomads were.
Yeah.
They roamed so much of that desert and land that I think that causes major issues today.
My hope is that it's not land that God wants us. He gives us things for us to as tools. So if He gives you a piece of land, He gives it to you as a tool, not as a covet to covet. And I think that's where we think, well, God gave me this, so therefore it's mine.
Yeah.
Well, it's not. And so if we're to pass it on and use it in good ways, and so, I think we need to get over this.
And one thing we need to do too, and then I need to run because I'm actually going to go read for the Advent candle. One thing that we can focus on is, so we talked earlier a few weeks ago about how the language of widows and orphans is code language for anybody who's poor and oppressed. In ancient Israel, the people who were poor and oppressed were widows and orphans. It's going to look different in different cultures with different rules and ways that it operates, right? So we get all of this language in the Old Testament about Israel getting its land back, right? Because that's how you're free. That's how you're liberated in the ancient world, is you have your own territory where you're not being oppressed by some other power. Of course, that's the way they're going to talk about freedom. And liberation is tied up with their own culture, right? Well, we live in a different culture. We need to talk about the ways that we would think about freedom and liberation in ours, right? And it isn't tied up with land in the way it is in the ancient world. So sometimes what we're doing is we're taking a metaphor and making it this concrete thing, right? Or we're taking the cultural example and saying this applies in all times and all places, right? So part of what we need to ask is this promise of this land, this promised land, is it for Israel for all time? Or are we saying God has sort of said, yes, this was for a period of time, but now the promise I made to Abraham is for every human being through Jesus. How do we expand on that, right? And what does this mean for Israel, Palestine? I don't have any easy answers.
If is Israel,
Yeah.
who is Palestine?
Well, I mean, who are the Palestinians? I mean, they're non-Jewish people, right? But they're the people who end up being in the land after Israel's kicked out. I mean, that's the other thing of what happens to Israel after Jesus. Not all of them are. I mean, it's actually the Christians in Israel are predominantly Palestinians, right? But who are they, right? They're the people who were here after the Romans kicked the Israelites out. They're the people who stayed, who weren't Jews, right? And they became Christians, then a bunch of them became Muslims, right? And then Israel gets the territory back in the 40s, right? 1940s, and what do? There's people already here, right? It gets complicated really quick.
Anyway,
Yeah.
but the only comment I would make is Abraham's lineage includes more than Isaac.
Yeah, well, that's the other issue, right? That's something else we have to try to figure out is, right, we get Abraham's lineage goes in a certain way, but there's all kinds of other branches that diverge off, right? What do we do with those? Right?
Great.
Lots to talk about.